The transport ship's engines groaned to a halt as it settled onto the landing pad of Varela 7, sending clouds of rust-colored dust swirling across the colony's modest skyline. Corporal Dax Reeves shouldered his pack and stepped into the thin atmosphere, his breathing apparatus automatically adjusting to the planet's lower oxygen levels. The frontier mining colony stretched before him like a collection of prefabricated buildings huddled against the alien landscape's harsh beauty. "Welcome to paradise," muttered Lieutenant Kane, the colony's security chief, as he approached the landing pad. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years staring at hostile horizons. "Hope you're ready for some real excitement, Corporal." Dax followed Kane through the colony's main thoroughfare, noting how the residents moved with the careful efficiency of people living on borrowed time. The recent mining disaster had left its mark, not just in the obvious repairs to damaged structures, but in the way conversations died when strangers approached and how everyone seemed to glance nervously at the ground beneath their feet. "Commander Torres wants to brief you immediately," Kane said, leading him toward the administrative complex. "There's been some complications since the collapse 3 weeks ago." The commander's office was sparse and functional, dominated by holographic displays showing mining operations and seismic data. Commander Elena Torres stood with her back to the door, studying a geological survey that flickered with red warning indicators. "Corporal Reeves," she said without turning around. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Yes, ma'am." "Ready for assignment?" Torres finally faced him, her dark eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that had kept her alive in hostile territory for over 2 decades. "Good. Because we have a situation that requires discretion." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "The mining collapse that killed 17 people wasn't just a tragedy, it's become a security issue." Dax settled into the chair, his military training keeping his expression neutral despite his curiosity. "How so, Commander?" "There's a survivor. Melira Voss. She's not human." Torres paused, choosing her words carefully. "Her species, the Zulhari, are known for their geological expertise. Her mate, Joran, was our chief surveyor before the accident. Since his death, she's been making wild claims about a second collapse. Talks about unstable fault lines, sabotage, conspiracy theories." "And you believe she's unstable?" Torres moved to the window, looking out at the colony's industrial sector where massive excavators sat silent. "Grief affects different species in different ways. The Zulhari form incredibly strong pair bonds. When one dies, the survivor often experiences what their physicians call cognitive fracturing. Hallucinations, paranoid delusions, the inability to process reality." Dax nodded, though something in the commander's tone suggested there was more to the story. "What's my role in this?" "Keep her away from the mining operations and the other colonists. She's been wandering the cliffs at night, disturbing the workers with her warnings about impending disaster. Some of the more superstitious miners are starting to believe her." Torres turned back to face him. "We can't afford panic, Corporal. This colony produces 30% of the sector's rare earth minerals. If production stops because of one grieving alien's delusions, it affects the entire frontier defense initiative." As if summoned by their conversation, a low rumble shook the building. Torres grabbed her desk for balance while Dax automatically reached for his sidearm. The tremor lasted only seconds, but its effects lingered in the suddenly tense silence. "Aftershocks," Torres said quickly, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the desk edge. "Perfectly normal after a major collapse." The geological team confirmed it. But Dax had noticed something else, the way the holographic displays had flickered during the tremor, showing a brief spike in seismic activity that seemed to originate from an area far from the original mining site. He filed the observation away for later consideration. "Understood, Commander. When do I meet this Melira Voss?" "You don't. That's the point." Torres moved back to her desk, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Your job is to monitor her activities and ensure she doesn't interfere with operations. Think of yourself as a guardian angel, one she never sees. Dax left the briefing with more questions than answers, but 20 years of military service had taught him when to probe and when to observe. As he walked through the colony toward his assigned quarters, he paid attention to the details others might miss, the way construction crews avoided certain areas, how the seismic monitoring station seemed clustered around the mining site while leaving vast areas unmonitored, and most tellingly, how everyone he passed seemed to be listening for something just beneath the edge of hearing. The sun was setting behind Varela 7's jagged mountain range when he finally spotted her. A figure moved along the cliff tops above the colony, silhouetted against the amber sky. Even at this distance, he could see the distinctive pale blue skin and the wild copper hair that marked her as Zulhari. Melira Voss, the alien widow everyone called Delusional. She stood at the cliff's edge, her arms raised toward the stars as if pleading with them for answers. And in that moment, watching her solitary vigil, Dax made a decision that would change everything. He would listen when no one else would. The next evening, Dax waited until the colony settled into its nightly routine before making his way to the cliffs. He'd spent the day reviewing seismic data from the colony's archives, and what he'd found disturbed him more than he cared to admit. The patterns were subtle but consistent, microtremors occurring in sequences that seemed almost too regular to be natural. The path to the cliff tops was treacherous in the darkness, lit only by Varela 7's twin moons. As he climbed, Dax could hear something that made him pause, a voice, low and melodic, speaking in what he recognized as the Zulhari language. The translator in his ear converted the words, and he realized she was reciting geological formations like a prayer. Sedimentary layers, igneous intrusions, fault displacement ratios. The litany continued as he approached, each technical term delivered with the reverence others might reserve for religious texts. Melira stood at the cliff's edge, her pale blue skin almost luminescent in the moonlight. Her red curls caught the breeze, and even from behind, Dax could see the tension in her slender frame. She wore a simple mining suit, modified with Zulhari cultural markings that indicated her status as a widow. "You can come closer," she said without turning around, her accented English carrying clearly in the thin air. "I know you've been watching me." Dax stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving away from his weapon. "Ma'am. I'm Corporal Reeves. The new guardian angel." She turned to face him, and Dax felt his breath catch. Her features were delicately alien, high cheekbones, large eyes that seemed to hold starlight, and skin that bore the subtle bioluminescent patterns common to her species. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that struck him most, sharp and clear despite the grief that shadowed them. "Commander Torres thinks you're here to babysit the crazy widow." "Are you?" he asked simply. For the first time in their conversation, Melira smiled, an expression both bitter and beautiful. "Crazy? Perhaps. Wrong? No." She reached into her pack and withdrew a data pad, its screen flickering with geological readings. "My mate spent 5 years mapping this planet's substrata. He knew every fault line, every unstable formation, every place where the rock remembered ancient trauma." She moved closer, and Dax caught the faint scent of ozone that seemed to cling to her skin, a byproduct of her species' bioelectric nature. 3 days before the collapse, Joran came home agitated. He'd found something in the deep surveys, something that made him request an immediate halt to mining operations. "What kind of something?" Melira's fingers danced across the data pad's surface, bringing up a three-dimensional map of the colony's underground structure. "Artificial stress patterns. Someone had been using microcharges to weaken specific support structures over the course of months. Joran called it surgical sabotage, precise enough to look like natural failure, but devastating enough to clear out entire sections of profitable mining claims." Dax studied the holographic display, his military training helping him recognize the tactical precision of the pattern. Who would have access to place charges like that? Someone with mining credentials, geological knowledge, and the authority to access restricted areas. Her eyes met his, and he saw the pain there, not just grief, but the anguish of someone who knew the truth but couldn't make anyone believe her. "Someone who wanted my mate dead before he could file his report." A tremor ran through the ground beneath their feet, stronger than the one from the previous day. Melira immediately consulted her data pad, her expression growing more worried. "It's accelerating," she whispered. "The secondary fractures are spreading faster than Joran predicted." Secondary fractures. She pointed toward the colony's main reactor, its lights glowing like a beacon in the darkness. The sabotage didn't just cause the mining collapse, it destabilized the entire geological foundation. There's a major fault line running directly under the power station. If it gives way. Dax didn't need her to finish the sentence. A reactor breach would irradiate half the continent and kill everyone in the colony within hours. How long do we have? According to Joran's calculations. Maybe a week. Maybe less. Melira closed the data pad and looked at him with desperate hope. "You're the first person who's listened to me in 3 weeks. Will you help me prove it?" Standing there in the moonlight, with the wind carrying the scent of her fear and determination, Dax found himself making another decision that would have horrified his commanding officers. "Show me everything." Melira's relief was palpable, and for a moment, her composure cracked. She stepped closer, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of gratitude that sent an unexpected warmth through him. "Thank you, Dax. I was beginning to think I really was losing my mind." "You're not crazy," he said softly, surprised by the protectiveness he felt toward this alien woman he'd just met. "Grief-stricken, maybe. Desperate, definitely. But not crazy." They spent the next hour going through Joran's research, Melira explaining the geological principles while Dax applied his tactical analysis training to the sabotage patterns. The more they worked together, the more convinced he became that she was right, and the more aware he became of her presence beside him. When she leaned close to point out details on the display, he noticed the way her bioluminescent markings brightened slightly with concentration. When she spoke about her mate's work, her voice carried both love and loss in equal measure. And when their hands accidentally touched while manipulating the holographic controls, he felt a connection that transcended species boundaries. "We need physical evidence," Dax said finally. "Something that will convince Torres and the mining board." Melira nodded, her red curls catching the moonlight. "Joran hid backup files in our quarters. Seismic readings, chemical analysis of the blast residue, even surveillance footage from the mining tunnels. But I need help accessing them. The colony sealed our apartment after the accident." "I can get you in," Dax said without hesitation. "But we'll have to be careful. If someone really is behind this, they won't want that evidence coming to light." As they prepared to leave the cliffs, Melira caught his arm again. This time, her touch lingered, and when she looked up at him, there was something more than gratitude in her alien eyes. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. You have no reason to believe my story." Dax considered the question, thinking about Commander Torres's warnings and his own military training that emphasized following orders without question. But looking into Melira's eyes, seeing the intelligence, the pain, and the fierce determination there, he realized his answer was simpler than he'd expected. "Because you're not asking me to believe you," he said. "You're asking me to think for myself. And because..." He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "Because I've seen too many good people dismissed as crazy when they were just inconvenient." Melira's smile this time was genuine, transforming her face from beautiful to radiant. And as they made their way back down the treacherous cliff path, Dax realized that whatever happened next, his life on Varela 7 had just become infinitely more complicated, and infinitely more meaningful. The colony's residential sector was eerily quiet at 3 in the morning, with only the distant hum of atmospheric processors breaking the silence. Dax led Melira through the maintenance corridors he'd memorized during his first day, avoiding the main pathways where security cameras might record their presence. "This way," he whispered, gesturing toward a service hatch that provided access to the sealed apartment block. His hands worked quickly on the electronic lock, military training making short work of civilian security systems. Melira's quarters were exactly as they'd been left 3 weeks ago, a shrine to an interrupted life. Personal belongings lay scattered where they'd fallen during the seismic shock of the mining collapse. Geological samples lined the walls in careful displays, and star charts covered the ceiling in the Zulhari tradition of bringing the cosmos indoors. "Joran's study is through here," Maelira said, her voice tight with emotion as she navigated around overturned furniture. She paused at the doorway, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the controls. Dax gently covered her hand with his own. "Take your time. I know this is difficult." She looked up at him, and in the dim light, he could see tears gathering in her large eyes. He was going to present his findings to the mining board the day after the collapse. We had dinner planned, and he was so excited about exposing what he'd discovered. He said it would make the colony safer for everyone. The study was a testament to methodical brilliance. Geological surveys covered every available surface, connected by colored threads that traced fault lines and mineral deposits across detailed maps. Holographic projectors displayed three-dimensional models of the planet's crust, frozen in the middle of some complex analysis. There, Maelira pointed to a secured storage unit built into the wall. He kept his most sensitive findings in there. But it requires both our biometric signatures to open. Dax watched as she placed her palm on the scanner, then stepped back with a confused expression when nothing happened. "It should have opened with just mine now that he's..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Maybe there's a secondary protocol," Dax suggested gently. He examined the unit more closely and found a small data port. "Could we extract the information directly?" Maelira nodded, pulling a portable data extractor from her pack. As she worked, Dax found himself studying her profile in the soft light from the holographic displays. There was something mesmerizing about the way she moved, the careful precision of her gestures, the way her bioluminescent markings pulsed gently with her heartbeat. "Got it," she said, and suddenly the room filled with holographic data streams. Seismic readings, chemical analyses, surveillance footage, and geological surveys painted a picture of systematic sabotage that was both brilliant and horrifying. "Look at this," she said, manipulating the display to show the mining tunnels from 3 months ago. "See these microfractures in the support beams? They're not natural stress patterns, they're the result of precisely placed explosives designed to look like metal fatigue." Dax leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers as he studied the evidence. The contact sent an unexpected shiver through him, and he was surprised to notice that her bioluminescent markings brightened slightly at his proximity. Who had access to place charges in these locations? That's what Joran was trying to determine when he died. Maelira pulled up another file, this one showing security footage from the mining administration offices. He'd narrowed it down to 3 suspects, all with the necessary credentials and opportunity. The first suspect was Lieutenant Kane, whose security clearance gave him access to all areas of the colony. The second was Chief Mining Engineer Voss, no relation to Maelira despite the shared surname. The third made Dax's blood run cold. "Commander Torres," he said quietly. "She's been pushing for expanded mining operations in the exact areas that Joran identified as geologically unstable," Maelira explained. "The collapse cleared out a section of tunnel that was blocking access to the richest mineral deposits on the planet. Deposits worth enough to fund a private fleet." As if summoned by their discovery, the building's security system suddenly activated, bathing the apartment in harsh red light. An alarm began to wail, an automated voice announced, "Unauthorized access detected. Security team dispatched." "We need to go," Dax said, grabbing the portable storage device from Maelira's hands. "Now." They ran through the apartment, but the sound of boots in the corridor told them they were too late. Dax pushed Maelira behind an overturned bookshelf just as the door burst open and Lieutenant Kane entered with 2 security officers. "Search everything," Kane ordered. "Someone's been here." Hidden in the shadows, Dax felt Maelira's body pressed against his back, her breathing rapid but controlled. Her hand found his in the darkness, and he was surprised by how right it felt to hold her fingers in his own. The connection between them had been growing since their first meeting on the cliffs, and now, in this moment of shared danger, it crystallized into something deeper. Nothing here, sir, one of the officers reported. But the storage unit's been accessed. Kane's cursing was creative and multilingual. Find them. Check the maintenance tunnels, the transport bay, everywhere. And put out an alert for the widow, she's more dangerous than we thought. After the security team left, Dax and Melira remained hidden for several more minutes, neither wanting to break the intimate contact. Finally, he turned in the small space, finding her face inches from his own. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath warm against his cheek. "For believing me. For helping me. For—" He silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "We're not safe yet. But Melira." He paused, struck by the intensity of what he was feeling. "When this is over, when we've exposed the truth and saved the colony, I want to talk about what's happening between us." Her eyes widened, and her bioluminescent markings flared briefly. "Dax, I haven't felt anything like this since before Joran died. I thought I never would again." "Grief doesn't have to mean the end of everything," he said softly. "Sometimes it means the beginning of something new." She leaned closer, and for a moment, he thought she might kiss him. Instead, she rested her forehead against his, a gesture of intimacy among her people that felt more meaningful than any human expression of affection. "First we save the colony," she said. "Then we figure out what this means." They escaped through the same maintenance tunnels that had brought them in, but their mission was far from over. With the evidence secured and their enemies alerted to their activities, the real danger was just beginning. And somewhere beneath their feet, the geological time bomb that had killed Joran continued counting down toward a catastrophe that would dwarf the mining collapse. But they had each other now, and Dax was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons, they were fought with trust, truth, and the courage to listen when everyone else had stopped caring. The abandoned mining outpost on Varela 7's eastern plateau had been their sanctuary for 2 days now, but Dax could see the strain wearing on Melira. She'd barely slept, constantly monitoring the seismic readings on her portable equipment while he tried to figure out how to get their evidence to someone who would act on it. "The tremors are accelerating," she said, looking up from her data pad with exhausted eyes. "We have maybe 18 hours before the main fault gives way." Dax moved to where she sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic displays showing the colony's underground structure. He'd been watching her work for hours, mesmerized by the way she seemed to communicate with the planet itself, reading its geological whispers like a language only she understood. "You need to rest," he said, settling beside her. "You can't save anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I can't rest while 3,000 people are sitting on top of a geological bomb," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual strength. "And every minute we waste here is another minute closer to—" He silenced her by taking her hands in his, feeling the slight tremor of fatigue in her fingers. "Melira. Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and he saw not just exhaustion but fear that she would fail, that she would lose another person she cared about, that her warnings would once again fall on deaf ears until it was too late. "We're going to stop this," he said with quiet conviction. "But first, you need to trust me to take care of you." Something in his tone made her bioluminescent markings pulse softly, and she leaned into his touch. "I haven't had anyone to trust in so long," she whispered. "After Joran died, I felt so alone. Like I was screaming into the void and no one could hear me." "I hear you," Dax said, moving closer until their knees touched. "I see you. And I'm not going anywhere." The kiss happened naturally, as if they'd been moving toward this moment since their first meeting on the cliffs. Her lips were softer than he'd imagined, and when she responded, pressing closer to him, he tasted starlight and sorrow and something that might have been hope. When they broke apart, her bioluminescent markings were glowing brighter, creating patterns of light across her skin that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Or am I so desperate for connection that I'm imagining?" He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands threading through her copper curls. "Does it feel imagined?" "No," She breathed against his lips. It feels like coming alive again. They made love there on the hard floor of the abandoned outpost, surrounded by the tools of their investigation and the countdown to disaster. It was desperate and tender and unlike anything Dax had ever experienced. Malira's alien biology meant her skin was more sensitive than human, and her bioluminescent markings created a light show that turned their coupling into something almost mystical. Afterward, she lay curled against his chest, tracing patterns on his skin while he played with her hair. For a few precious minutes, they existed in a bubble where geological catastrophes and sabotage conspiracies couldn't touch them. "We have to go back," she said eventually, though she made no move to leave his arms. "I know." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But first, tell me what you need to prove your case to the mining board." Malira sat up, and Dax admired the way the light from her markings played across her pale blue skin. "Direct seismic readings from the fault line under the reactor. If I can show them real-time data of the instability, they'll have to listen." "How close do we need to get?" "Close enough to plant sensors directly on the fault line. Which means going into the restricted mining tunnels below the reactor complex." Dax nodded, already running tactical scenarios in his head. "That's heavily guarded. Torres will have security patrols throughout the area." "There's another way," Malira said, calling up a geological survey on her data pad. Joran mapped a natural cave system that connects to the mining tunnels. "It's dangerous, unstable rock, toxic gases, narrow passages, but it would get us past the security perimeter." "How dangerous?" She met his eyes, and he saw the truth there before she spoke. "There's a good chance we won't make it back out." Dax considered this, weighing the risks against the lives of 3,000 colonists. But more than that, he thought about the woman beside him, about the way she'd been dismissed and ignored and branded as crazy when she was trying to save everyone. Someone needed to be her champion, to ensure her voice was finally heard. "Then we better make sure the data gets transmitted before anything happens to us," he said. They spent the next hour preparing for what might be their final mission. Dax checked his weapons while Malira calibrated her seismic sensors. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally stealing glances at each other with the intensity of new lovers who know their time might be measured in hours rather than years. "Dax," she said as they prepared to leave the outpost. "Whatever happens down there, I want you to know that meeting you has been the first good thing to happen to me since Joran died. You've given me hope again." "You've given me something too," he replied, securing his pack. "Purpose. And maybe something that feels a lot like love." Her bioluminescent markings flared at his words, and she kissed him fiercely, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate affection into the contact. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Let's go save the colony," she said. They descended into the cave system as the sun set over Varela, 7, racing against both time and the growing seismic instability that threatened to entomb them before they could complete their mission. But they had each other now, and sometimes that was enough to face the darkness. The cave system beneath Varela, 7 was a labyrinth of natural passages carved by millennia of geological activity. Dax led the way with a portable light source while Malira navigated using her intimate knowledge of the planet's underground structure. The air grew thicker as they descended, and more than once they had to squeeze through openings barely wide enough for their bodies. "There," Malira whispered, pointing to a faint glow ahead. "That's artificial lighting from the mining tunnels." They emerged into a maintenance corridor deep beneath the reactor complex, and immediately Dax could feel the vibration of massive machinery through the walls. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows, and the air tasted of ozone and metal. "The fault line runs directly under the primary reactor chamber," Malira said, consulting her data pad. "We need to get to the lowest level." They moved through the tunnels like ghosts, avoiding the security patrols that Dax could hear in the distance. His military training served them well, allowing him to anticipate patrol routes and identify safe passages. But with each step deeper into the facility, the seismic tremors grew stronger. "Here," Malira said, stopping at an access panel marked with radiation warnings. The main fault line is just beyond this bulkhead. Dax watched as she worked, her movements precise despite the danger. She placed seismic sensors at strategic points along the fault line, each device designed to transmit real-time geological data to the surface. The readings were terrifying, massive pressure building along a fracture that ran directly under the colony's primary power source. "How long?" he asked. "Minutes," she said, her face pale in the emergency lighting. "The main fracture is starting to propagate. When it fails completely." An explosion above them cut off her words, sending debris raining down into the tunnel. Emergency klaxons began wailing, and automated voices announced a reactor breach protocol. "They're trying to initiate an emergency shutdown," Dax realized. "But if the fault gives way during the process, the containment systems will fail," Melira finished. "We need to transmit this data now." She activated her equipment, sending the seismic readings directly to the mining board, the colonial administration, and every communication system she could access. The evidence was undeniable: geological instability caused by deliberate sabotage, with catastrophic failure imminent. "There," she said as the transmission completed. "Whatever happens now, they'll know the truth." The tunnel shook violently, and cracks appeared in the walls around them. Dax grabbed Melira's hand, pulling her toward the cave entrance they'd used to enter the facility. But as they ran, he could hear the sound of boots behind them, security forces, probably led by the same people who had orchestrated the sabotage. They reached the cave mouth just as Lieutenant Kane and two officers rounded the corner, weapons drawn. "That's far enough," Kane called out. "You've caused enough trouble." "The colony is going to be destroyed," Melira said, stepping forward despite Dax's protective gesture. "The reactor is sitting on an unstable fault line that you people created. We've transmitted the proof." "Proof of terrorist activity," Kane interrupted. "Evidence that you've been sabotaging mining operations and threatening reactor safety." Dax felt rage building in his chest. Even now, with the ground literally cracking beneath their feet, they were trying to silence Melira. "The seismic data doesn't lie, Kane. And we know about the conspiracy." Kane's weapon swung toward him, but before anyone could fire, the tunnel floor gave way. The main fault line failure was everything Melira had predicted and worse. The sound was like the planet screaming, a deep grinding roar that seemed to come from the very core of Varela, 7. Kane and his officers were thrown against the walls as the passage collapsed behind them, cutting off their escape route. "The reactor," Melira gasped, checking her data pad even as debris rained around them. "The automatic systems are holding, but barely. If we can get to the surface." "This way," Dax said, leading them deeper into the cave system. It was counterintuitive, but the natural passages had survived geological upheavals for millions of years. They were their best chance of reaching safety. They emerged onto the surface just as the sun rose over Varela, 7, and what they saw took their breath away. The entire colony was in motion, evacuation ships lifting off while ground crews worked frantically to stabilize the reactor complex. Melira's transmitted data had triggered emergency protocols that were already saving lives. Commander Torres was waiting for them at the Evacuation Coordination Center, her face grim but no longer dismissive. "The mining board received your transmission," she said to Melira. "They're calling it the most comprehensive evidence of industrial sabotage they've ever seen." "What about the reactor?" Dax asked. "Stable for now. Your warning gave us time to implement containment protocols." Torres looked directly at Melira, and Dax saw something that might have been respect in her eyes. "I owe you an apology. We should have listened." "My mate died trying to warn you," Melira said quietly. "But at least his work finally served its purpose." Over the following days, the investigation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Kane had been working with several mining corporation executives to destabilize the colony's operations, clearing the way for a corporate takeover of the most profitable deposits. The evidence Joran had gathered was enough to bring down the entire network. But for Dax and Melira, the real revelation came in the quiet moments between debriefings and testimony. They walked the cliffs where they'd first met, watching the repair crews work to stabilize the colony's foundations. "What happens now?" she asked, her hand entwined with his as they stood at the edge of forever. "Now we figure out what comes next," he said, turning to face her. "I've been offered a permanent position here, heading up colonial security. And there's talk of establishing a geological research institute, one that would need a director with your expertise." Melira smiled, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with happiness. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I'm asking you to build something new with me," Dax said. "A life where your voice is heard, where your knowledge is valued, where we can create something beautiful together." She kissed him then, there on the cliffs where she'd once stood alone in her grief, and her answer was written in the way her skin glowed with joy. Around them, Varela, 7 hummed with the sound of reconstruction and renewal, a colony that had learned to listen to its most unlikely prophet. Months later, as they stood together in the laboratory of the new Geological Research Institute, monitoring the planet's now stable seismic activity, Dax reflected on how much had changed. Melira was no longer the grieving widow dismissed as delusional, she was the most respected geological expert in the sector, her warnings having saved thousands of lives. And he was no longer just a soldier following orders. He was a partner, a protector, and most importantly, someone who had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the courage to listen when everyone else had stopped caring. "The readings are perfect," Melira said, looking up from her instruments with a smile that could power the entire colony. "The planet is at peace." "So are we," Dax replied, pulling her into his arms. And as her bioluminescent markings painted patterns of light across the laboratory walls, he knew that their story was just beginning.